Okay, I'm Kevin Sutter. I'm from IBM. There's going to be a little bit of a slant on some of my charts because when I mention application server, I am going to talk about WebSphere Liberty. So a little bit of a slant there, but I just touch on that a little bit. And what this presentation is about is just to give you some of our experiences with Java 9 and the new stuff that's coming, specifically in the modularity arena. So first, I'm going to talk about just some general things with Java 9, and maybe many of you know this stuff already, but I guess I kind of want to find out, now I know we've got some Eclipse developers here that are very familiar with Java 9, but from a using standpoint, how many people have actually even tried using Java 9? Just a handful. Okay. So maybe this talk will be okay because it is very introductory. The idea is just to give some background on Java 9, some of our experiences, and how you might be able to learn from some of our experiences. Okay, so all of these JEPs that went in, I'm not covering all that, just so that you know. This is just to demonstrate how many different features went into Java 9. If you went to Donald Smith's talk this morning, you've heard about, we got to do faster releases of Java. And part of it is because we don't want that type of content waiting 3 years before it shows up. So that's part of the reason why they're going to a faster release cycle. And I've got a little chart on that too in case you haven't heard about that. So out of all that stuff that I just showed, I'm only going to focus on two parts. One is the JDK layout on disk is changing, and the other part is modularity. Okay? So if you've been using Java 6, Java 7, Java 8 for many years, you know the format over here on the left-hand side. You've got the JDK, you've got the JRE that's embedded within that, you've got multiple bin directories, you've got special directories like the endorsed, that has special privileges if you put stuff in there. So all of that you might be used to is changing. If you look over here on the right-hand side, that's the layout of Java 9. There's only one bin directory. There's no special endorsed directory. EXTDIR, that goes away. So it's a totally different layout. So the reason I'm pointing this out is right down here. If you have applications that are dependent on this file layout, you're going to have some changes that have to be done. Now, I pointed out here from an IBM standpoint, we're modifying all of our IBM products when we do support Java 9. We are modifying our products that are dependent on the layout. If any of you are traditional WebSphere customers, you know that we're very dependent on the layout of the JDK, and we ship the JDK with traditional WebSphere, and we're very dependent on that layout. So we have some changes to do in this area. I'm guessing we're not the only ones. I'm guessing you all have applications that are somehow dependent on this layout, or maybe the special privileges that with the endorsed or EXTDIRs. So something to be aware of. Also point out down here, I didn't get a big show of hands of people that have actually tried using it yet. I would recommend it. If you're working in a shop and even if you're currently totally happy with Java 8, you might want to just try out Java 9. Get a feel for it. Find out what the impact is going to be. And on another chart here, I talk about a tool that will help. Okay, so now the other big change, modularity. Okay, so we've all heard Jigsaw, big news. It even had a hiccup as it was trying to release, but we eventually got it out. But this is not the first release that Oracle or Sun before them tried to get modularity into the Java runtime. Started way back in 2005 and 6 with the first iteration on this, or the first thoughts. And in this time frame, 2005, 6, 7, that's when Apache Harmony was trying to come out with some modularity for Java. All of those, they kind of, you know, rose up and then they kind of fizzled away. Tried again here with JSR 294. Well, actually this one, 291 with the OSGi, and then 294. Finally, Jigsaw kind of took hold, but it took several releases before it finally came out. The first iteration of Jigsaw was targeted for Java 7, and then missed it. Then moved to Java 8, missed that. Finally, in Java 9, it came out. So, you know, just for your awareness, this has been going on for quite a while. This talks about high-level goals of the module system. I mean, since this is partially an OSGi conference, I mean, I could put OSGi up there. Those are high-level goals for OSGi. You want reliable configuration of your programs to be able to define your dependencies, and then also have strong encapsulation to prevent illegal access or unwanted access to your APIs or to your internals. You've probably all seen a chart like this. You probably all lived through it. We are very reliant on the class path. And when we need to find a class, there's a whole slew of libraries that have to be examined and you know, brought up, taken a look at to try to find the class that is required. Some people call it jar hell. You've heard of class path hell. It's very difficult to find all the necessary dependencies that are required for your application, especially when you start to have different dependencies on different versions. And so then you have to try to play tricks with your class path and either get them in the right order or use parent last, parent first type ordering to try to find the right combination so that the proper class is found by the right library. It's very difficult. So one of the things with Jigsaw is providing strong encapsulation. And this is where your internal APIs are hidden. Only your public APIs are provided to your customers. You are defining what APIs are available to come out of your module. Big thing here, okay, so it says Java 9 will not discriminate. This chart deck was actually, you know, put in place prior to some discussions that happened late in the Jigsaw development cycle. Originally, Java 9 was going to be very adamant on making sure that everything was defined appropriately for modules out of the box. They have had to soften that a little bit because they kind of found out that even though Hello World may have worked, there's a whole mess of other applications that would not have worked out of the box with Java 9, so they had to kind of soften that a little bit. And I have a chart later on that will explain that, that option. Okay, so this is a tool that I was mentioning earlier, this JDEPs. This is available both in Java 8 and Java 9. So if you're currently on Java 8, you're just kind of wondering, well, what's going to be the impact when I try to move to Java 9? This tool here, JDEPs, will examine your application and give you an idea of, hey, you're touching all these different internal APIs. You're going to have to do something different. Many of them, there's help text that is provided with that. So maybe like with this one here, this base 64 encoder, that actually moved up into an API. So there is some help text that says, hey, you use this old internal access, but here's the proper API that you're supposed to use to accomplish the same function. In some cases, it may come up and say, okay, you're trying to access something internal, you went beyond the API boundary. No, we really don't know what you're going to do to get around this when you move to Java 9. So there's some that are kind of scary when they pop up, but I would recommend trying to use that tool. We use this tool extensively when we were making our changes to the WebSphere products. We wanted to get a reading on how big of an effort this was going to be. So this is very helpful. Okay, so modules are a new type. So we've got classes, interfaces, packages, and now modules. So it's a definition that you put into a file. It's called moduleinfo.java. You end up compiling that with Java-C, just like any other Java program. It's put at your root directory, your module root directory, so very similar to like if you had a package info.java. So same type of idea. It's not extensible though. This is one thing that is different if you're comparing it to OSGi. OSGi is a little, you can extend it, the definition of bundles within OSGi. But this module definition, it's not extensible. So once you have defined it, that's it. So this gives you an idea. If you were at Kahoot last night, this was one of the questions that came up, that I wanted to know, well, what module contains, and I can't remember, it was something within Java Lang. I don't remember what it was. But the module is actually java.base. Okay, and then this defines what packages are going to be exported from java.base. Now, of course, there's an ellipsis here. Java.base is big. There's several different packages in there that are exported. And then your application, how you would define this, so you've got a module info for your application, and you would define that, okay, I have a requirement on java.base. So here you would put in requires java.base, and that gives you access to these things within Java base. Okay? And then your application, maybe you've got APIs that other parts of your application might want to access, so you have other exports here as well. Okay? So that's the wiring that happens. You define your exports or your imports and your requires. I mentioned earlier a class path. So what we have now is a module path. Now, some people say, well, what's the difference? It's still going to be complicated. The big difference is that because of the module definitions that are defined, the module info, the module path will be better from that perspective with defining your dependencies. The problem down here is they decided that, I don't know why. Maybe it was too complicated, they didn't have enough time or whatever, but they're not going to support version information. So when you define your modules, you can say, okay, I have a requirement on library XYZ, but you cannot say XYZ 5.1. So there's no version semantics associated with these modules like what we have in OSGi. That's a big difference between modules in JPMS or Jigsaw and bundles within OSGi. It's a big hole. Now, whether or not they accept this and they take it forward to eventually fix this, I don't know. I was in Neil Bartlett's talk this morning, and he kind of indicated that it was just going to be left up to the tooling to help figure this out. So I don't know exactly where Oracle and the community is going to go with this, but we feel that this is kind of a hole. This chart, I want to point out the good thing is that OSGi and modules, they can play together. It may be difficult to get your exact relationship that you require, and we've had to jump through some hoops within our WebSphere application servers. Both traditional and Liberty, we are very much an OSGi shop. We are very dependent on OSGi, and that was some of the work that we ended up doing with the Oracle team to ensure that we can continue to process within the module definition. So the metadata that's defined in your module info.class, we can merge that with the OSGi definition that's in your manifest. So there's some conflicts, there's some things that have to be massaged, but a single jar file can be both a module and an OSGi bundle. And that's the key message that I wanted to get out of this. Because these APIs, or the internals, are now defined as to what you have access to, not only is that from a Java C perspective, a compile perspective, but it also affects reflection. So you can't beat the system. You can't say, oh, heck, I can go in through reflection. I can get access to this stuff. Nope. There's controls in place that if you try to go in through reflection and try to get access to these things, depending on when you try to do it, if it's at compile time or at runtime, you will get some type of error back. If you are trying to access something in a module that was not defined to be accessible. Okay, and then here I mentioned that there are runtime options to break out of the modularity. I don't think that's the next chart. Nope, I have it in the application server section. Okay, so taking a little bit of a detour, this is some information that I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of. I've heard it at a couple of sessions this week. I was at Java 1, and it's a big story there, but I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of this. So Java 9 is the last release that will follow that naming convention. Okay, so next March, the next release of Java is going to be called 18.3. So it's 2018, third month. That's what that one is going to be. And then in September, there will be another release, and that's 18.9. Okay, so the releases for Java, it's Java 9, and then it will be 18.3 and 18.9. Okay, now that's, and then they expect to repeat that. So it's every 6 months. So then it'll be 19.3, 19.9, and so on. That's the release cycle that is in plan for Java. Whoops, just a second. Now, the other key thing here is the idea of long-term support. I think that's kind of a new term that they kind of coined for this. But whenever we think of, whether it's Java 6, Java 7, Java 8, we have to be concerned, well, when is that going to go out of support? We have to know when to get our customers off of that version and onto something that is supported. So what they are defining is every 3 years, they will define a release that will have the long-term support. So I don't want to scare anybody. This was Donald Smith's mention this morning. But Java 9 itself will go out of support when 18.3 comes out. Okay? But what he tried to explain this morning was, okay, but don't worry, because that's kind of similar to what they had before with Java 8. But, in our mind, I always thought of Java 7 having long-term support, Java 8 long-term support, and not a specific fix pack. But that's how they're kind of putting a twist on it. So they're saying that the long-term support starts with 18.9. Okay, so that's I would say, from a development shop perspective, that's the one that you probably want to focus on for long-term support for your development or production usage. And then just to put in a little plug for the IBM JDK. So we just came out with this Java 8 SR5. Normally, one of our fix packs that doesn't really, cause a whole lot of excitement. This one does, because what we are doing with SR5, we are basing it on our OpenJ9. So our JVM that is supporting Java 9, will also be supporting our JDK 8. So what that does is that gives the IBM JDK 8 a very long support cycle. And so with the underlying JVM being the same between our Java 8 and Java 9. So that's very key from an IBM JDK perspective. Okay, so I'm doing okay. I've had to crunch this down. This was a presentation that we actually took over an hour with, so I'm kind of cruising through some of the information. So, if you're a WebSphere customer, what does this mean to you? Java SE9, okay, is now complete. So where are we with the WebSphere support? We are focusing on our Liberty product. I mentioned earlier, traditional WebSphere has some special situations because of our dependency on the JDK. So we are focusing on Liberty first. Liberty has always had, well, it's always been agnostic of the JDK that you're running with. So you can, you could pick OpenJDK, Oracle JDK, IBM JDK. It doesn't matter. Pull it in and just make sure that Liberty knows where that JDK is at, and we will execute just fine. Same thing now with the with Java 9 in association with Liberty. If your applications are very nicely behaved and you are only using the interfaces as defined by the Java spec, everything will work great. I don't know how many of us ever do that. I mean, we're always looking for, okay, how can we take a shortcut? How can we get what we really want out of this? So if you went beyond the internal APIs, then you may encounter some situations when you're moving forward. I mentioned here Open Liberty. I don't know. I do have another chart on this. I'm going to just check right now. How many of you have heard of our open, we moved Liberty into open source. So it is available in the open source community. Okay, a few of you. So this was a major announcement for us at Java 1. So all of our, well, not all, there's, I don't know, 90% of our Liberty product is now in open source. We have it in a GitHub repository, and it's managed by the Eclipse public license. Currently, it's version 1. We have to move that to version 2 since we found out about it. But we're doing all of the work to support Java 9 out in the open. So that's, that's different for IBM. Normally, we're doing stuff in-house, and then we dump it over the wall. So we're doing all of it out in the open. You can monitor our progress. For the most part, we're working just fine. We demoed at Java 1. All of our demos that we did, we used Java 9 and OpenJ9 with our demos. Where we have run into a couple of situations is when we're dependent on older pieces of libraries. So JAX-WS with web services, we have an older version of a library there, and that one doesn't work very well with Java 9. So those are some of the things that we're working through to get resolved. But 95% of the product works just fine with Java 9. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about how do I get out of this hole? I mean, if Java 9 is going to stop me from accessing all these niceties that I had in the past, how can I get by that? Well, this is the part that they had to loosen up. When Java 9, if you follow that little, depending on your perspective, whether it was a nightmare or a hiccup, but Oracle had a little hiccup when they were trying to finalize JPMS. And one of the things that came out of that is they had to soften their stance. They could not go out the door and say, okay, we're going to require that everybody adheres to these module definitions, and we are going to issue errors and stop your program if you don't adhere to it. So they had to soften that up. It used to be that the first iteration of this had an option that called permit illegal access. And what they did when they finally went out the door is to modify that to give a, to give multiple values to illegal access. So the permission is now default for Java 9. So this will help your applications tremendously. So even if you run JDEPs and it has identified all these things that you might run into problems with, by default, Java 9 will just issue a warning if you accidentally go beyond the API boundaries. It tries to do just one warning per instance of that problem. Okay, so it's not meant to fill up your logs. There's been a couple of issues that, you know, they might have missed some of that, but for the most part, it's just one warning per. Now, as you start working this a little bit, you can turn on further debugging. If you say illegal access warn, then it will say every time you hit one, it'll issue a warning. So that will help you when you're getting further along, you've gotten past the major ones and you only have a few left, then you can use that option. Debug, that also, of course it does the warning, then it gives you a call stack at the same time, so you can get right down to the level of code that was causing the problem. And this is the interesting one, because deny, you can test out your applications to say, okay, if and when Oracle decides to make that the default, then will my programs run? So deny says, okay, put the brakes on, don't let me break any rules. So that one, you know, might have some interesting output for you if you wanted to try it. Okay, so this next section, this is kind of iffy, because one thing, Java EE, if you've been paying attention, that's going through a major transformation. And so we're moving Java EE into the open source environment and specifically into the Eclipse Foundation. So we don't really know exactly what we're going to be doing with modules with Java EE. But just to think about it for a little bit, we started wondering, okay, if we were to define modules for Java EE, if we want to call it 9, you know, what would be a module name? I mean, maybe it would be called javax.servlet to match the servlet specification. It hasn't been decided yet. So the next few charts just gives you an idea of kind of how difficult this is, at least from a Liberty perspective, but it's really with anyone who is using a module system, like JBoss has their own module system. So anything that is separate from JPMS, you kind of have to play some tricks. So if you think about this, the blue boxes here are modules, and the purple boxes here are OSGi bundles. So if you think about just a normal runtime today, your application could access OSGi bundles, and the OSGi bundles could access the Java 9 modules. Okay? So now bring in your application. You want to modularize your application. This is where it's going to get kind of difficult, because now you've got your application will have a strong dependency on the Java EE9, if you want to call it that module. And then that module will have dependencies into this area. But we still have to have OSGi bundles. So we have to play some tricks here in order to allow the bundles to actually load our independent APIs from our implementations to get everything loaded in order to execute correctly. Another thing that makes this a little tricky from an application server standpoint are module dependencies. Now, as we bring in jar files on the module path, they become unnamed modules. That allows these unnamed modules to access other modules within the boot layer. Okay? So there's a lot of dependencies that are allowed at this level. The problem is if you try to write an modularized application, you cannot specify a direct dependency from your application onto an unnamed module. That is not allowed by Java 9. Okay, so that makes it difficult to complete this picture at this point. So that means that until Liberty can provide some type of modules, or your application server, whatever it is, until you can define named modules, then you cannot have dependencies specified from your application layer down into your application server. Now, the other thing that can happen is if you have put your jar files in your module path, you get what is called automatic modules. And this allows access between your unnamed modules and the automatic modules. The dependencies go back the other way as well, but this chart would have just gotten very complicated to put all of these dependencies back on here. So it does go both ways. So my suggestion is to wait and see. I mean, from an application server standpoint, instead of trying to do your application in a module fashion, I would wait. Wait for your application server and its associated dependencies to support some level of JPMS, because until you can get defined modules, your application can't really define the dependencies anyway. So if you tried to do it top down where your application is trying to use JPMS, then everything is automatic or unnamed modules underneath it, and you're not really getting any benefit of the module definitions and the dependencies that are defined. So you could do it, but it's not really buying you a whole lot. Okay, so almost out of time, but I did want to just put in a little plug here. This is what we have done, or we announced at Java 1. Open Liberty, openliberty.io is our landing page, and all of our code is available. Here it is an Eclipse licensed source code, so at least it fits in with this conference. It's fully Java EE 7 compatible. We also have provided all of our microprofile support within this offering. So if you're interested in trying out an alternate open source application server, feel free to try Open Liberty. Okay, so I mentioned how Open Liberty pretty much supports Java 9 today. Most applications will work. There are some edge cases that don't yet, and we are working that, and they should be cleaned up relatively shortly. I recommended that you kind of wait for the bottom up, wait until the dependencies and the application servers can kind of support Java 9 before you try to do your applications. That's the suggestion. And, I guess this part here I didn't really spend a whole lot of time on. Eventually, with JPMS and the modules, we should be able to define smaller packages. One of the things that Neil Bartlett mentioned this morning, where you could define a smaller JDK with your application, and so the whole jar file may be, just tens of megs instead of hundreds of megs, depending on your application needs for the JDK. Okay, so I was able to get through it in, about 33 minutes. Any questions? Nothing? Come on. Okay. What? Okay,
The modular project, if it cannot access unnamed module, then how that unnamed module will be used?
Yeah, so it would just be used off of the module path. So the problem is that the application cannot specify a dependency on that unnamed module. So the dependency can only be specified with a named module. So if they're unnamed, then you can't specify the dependency. Okay, so that's why it kind of breaks the idea of a module application, because you're not getting the benefit of that dependency. Okay? Yes?
Right. If I'm coding an application in Java Standard Edition which
Okay, I didn't catch the last part.
If I'm coding an application that uses JDK,
Okay.
would I need to make all the packages of my entities visible for the JDK provider?
Okay, so that's part, in case other people didn't hear, he's asking about from JPA application, how can that be defined so that the application and the provider can properly communicate? And that's part of the problem that we haven't figured out yet. Java EE8 is only dependent on Java SE8. So there's no module definitions or anything was spec'd out yet for Java EE8. So that aspect of JPA, you would have to use that in an unnamed module type of environment to just allow basically, I'll just call it class path type access between JPA and your application. So until there are modules and that contract defined for JPA, you really can't do much. That's why it's very difficult for the application server to do this as well.
Shouldn't opens help for this?
What would help?
Opens to make packages accessible at runtime.
I'm not familiar with that. Sorry. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.